Ladies and gentlemen, every once in a while, the world delivers a plot twist so deliciously dramatic that even the most seasoned political thriller novelist would sigh and say, well, that's a bit far-fetched, isn't it? And yet here we are, living in a moment that feels as though someone has spiced up the global news cycle with an extra spoonful of masala. The United States of America, the world's self-appointed architect of free markets, has just been told no thank you by India, a country it once considered merely a promising sidekick in the great global trade orchestra. And this is not a polite, maybe later kind of no. This is a firm, bold, headline-making refusal that leaves Washington blinking into its morning coffee, wondering if it misheard. To understand the weight of this moment, picture it like this. Imagine walking into a fine restaurant, the kind with too many forks and waiters who whisper menus like sacred scrolls. You've been the most generous diner for decades, ordering bottles of the most expensive wine, and suddenly a fellow guest, who used to sit quietly at the corner table, says, "Actually, I don't want to share your wine anymore. I found something better, richer, and perhaps more to my taste." The gasp from the room would be audible. The maitre d' would faint. And yet, that's precisely what has happened on the grand dining table of geopolitics. India has, with a steady hand and perhaps a sly smile, turned down an American trade offer that was meant to cement economic ties, lock in influence, and remind the world that Uncle Sam still knows how to set the rules of the game. But this time, India has chosen not to play along. And in doing so, it has not just declined a deal, it has declared its independence in a far more resonant way than any speech, summit, or slogan could. The shock value here cannot be overstated. For decades, the United States has grown used to being the country no one really says no to. Sure, there have been debates, negotiations, foot-dragging here and there, but outright refusal? That's rare. Saying no to America is a bit like refusing dessert at a party. It confuses the host, alarms the other guests, and raises the awkward possibility that you might have a better meal waiting for you elsewhere. India, however, hasn't just refused dessert, it has quietly hinted it might be starting its own restaurant. The refusal sends a tremor through the global balance of power, because trade isn't just about goods and tariffs, it's about allegiance, about who trusts whom with their future. The US wanted a deal to reinforce its network of alliances, to send a message that India was firmly under its economic umbrella, especially in a time when rival powers are flexing their muscles. Instead, India has effectively walked out from under that umbrella, looked up at the rain clouds and said, "I think I'll manage on my own," and the shock is magnified by timing. America is no longer the confident superpower of the 1990s, standing tall as the unchallenged champion of globalization. It is instead navigating its own uncertainties, strained supply chains, domestic squabbles, a wary electorate, and a rival in China that seems intent on rewriting the rulebook of global commerce. For India to choose this exact moment to assert its independence is not just defiance, it's a masterstroke of timing, the kind of move that leaves opponents both furious and grudgingly impressed. One can imagine the reaction in Washington. Analysts poring over spreadsheets with furrowed brows, diplomats frantically arranging calls, think tanks rushing to update their PowerPoint slides, all while trying to frame the news in a way that doesn't sound like outright rejection. It's not a no, they might insist. It's a constructive pause. But to the world watching, the message is crystal clear. The apprentice has become the negotiator, and the mentor is left blinking, momentarily unsure of its authority. Of course, the ripple effects are enormous. The headlines will scream about betrayal, about strategic realignments, about the dawn of a new world order. But beyond the noise, what makes this moment truly shocking is its symbolism. India, the once called sleeping giant of Asia, has finally woken up, and rather than politely joining the American dream, it seems intent on writing a dream of its own. And in doing so, it has forced everyone else, from Beijing to Brussels, to recalibrate their expectations. This isn't just a trade decision, it's a cultural moment, a symbolic shrug from a nation that has spent decades proving itself on the global stage and is now confident enough to say, "We don't need validation, and we don't need to follow your script." And for America, used to holding the pen in this grand narrative, that realization is nothing short of shocking. If there is one thing history loves, it is irony. The kind of irony that would make Shakespeare pause mid-quill and mutter, "Really? That's a bit much." And in the case of India refusing an American trade deal, the irony is layered thicker than butter on toast. For centuries, India was the prized jewel of global trade routes, the land where spices, silks, and precious gems set sail to dazzle palates and pockets across Europe. So much so, in fact, that an entire empire decided to build its fortune on exploiting that trade, turning India into both the supplier and the customer of its own plunder. Fast forward to today, and suddenly the tables have turned. India is not the supplicant, but the decision maker. The same country that once had trade dictated to it is now dictating the terms. And if you don't hear the echo of history chuckling in the background, you're not listening closely enough. Think back to the days of the British East India Company. A corporation, mind you, not even a government, held the reins of Indian commerce and, by extension, Indian destiny. Spices, cotton, indigo, these weren't simply commodities, they were lifelines that fattened the coffers of London while draining those of Delhi. It was a quintessential example of trade as domination, of economic deals being less about mutual benefit and more about ensuring that one side always left the table hungrier than when they arrived. And yet, here we are, centuries later, and India is politely sliding the trade papers back across the table, saying, "No, thank you, we'll decide our own menu now." The historical irony deepens when you recall the era of post-independence India. For decades after 1947, the nation was often cast as hesitant, cautious, slow to embrace the bold promises of globalization. The West would look on with a mixture of impatience and paternalism, asking, why won't India just open up more, deregulate more, modernize faster? The underlying message was always the same. Progress was to be defined by Western standards, and India's role was to play catch-up. Yet today, when the US extends what it imagines to be an irresistible offer, India's refusal is a reminder that it is no longer trying to catch up. It has caught up in its own way, on its own terms, and is now confident enough to refuse the very same prescriptions it was once pressured to swallow. There is also irony in the personalities of the two nations involved. The United States, after all, prides itself on being the land of the free, the nation that threw off the shackles of colonialism through a Declaration of Independence so dramatic it could have been staged on Broadway. Its founding story is one of rejecting control, saying no to distant powers, and forging its own destiny. And now, in a twist that would make history teachers everywhere grin, it is America's turn to be on the receiving end of that very gesture. India has essentially pulled a page from America's own playbook, reminding the world that independence isn't just about waving flags, it's about the power to choose who you trade with and on what terms. And then, of course, there is the small matter of timing. America once played the role of benevolent tutor to developing nations, guiding them, or so it believed, toward modern economies and open markets. But India has grown up, graduated, and apparently decided it no longer needs a tutor. The student has walked out of the classroom, diploma in hand, and is now setting up their own school across the street. The former teacher, meanwhile, is left muttering, "But I taught you everything you know," to which India might well reply, "Yes, and now we're teaching ourselves what you don't." The irony also stretches beyond economics. Consider the cultural backdrop. For centuries, India was told it needed Western validation to be relevant on the world stage. English became the language of diplomacy. Western suits replaced dotis in boardrooms, and trade deals were signed with the implicit understanding that approval must flow westward. But today, when India turns down a US offer, it does so not in deference, but in defiance. It no longer needs validation, it already commands it. That act of refusal isn't just about dollars and tariffs, it's a symbolic flipping of the script. One that says, we are not the sidekick in your story, we are writing our own. And isn't that the most delightful twist of all? The same country that was once the victim of forced trade policies, reduced to a supplier of raw materials for someone else's glory, is now the one exercising the freedom to say no. Trade, once the very instrument of its subjugation, has become the instrument of its self-assertion. History, with its fondness for irony, has served up a reminder. Those who dictate the terms today may well be dictated to tomorrow. The phrase, balance of power, often sounds like something whispered in dimly lit rooms with leather chairs and dusty globes, as if it were the sole concern of retired diplomats who still write with fountain pens. But in reality, balance of power is the everyday heartbeat of geopolitics. It's about who gets to set the rules of the marketplace, who gets the first call when deals are made, and who is quietly left waiting in the corridor, hoping someone remembers their name. And right now, India's refusal of the US trade offer has tipped that balance ever so noticeably, like a seesaw where the heavy kid suddenly decides to jump off, leaving the other side thudding awkwardly into the ground. For decades, America has lived comfortably with the idea that it occupies the center of the seesaw. It has been the gravitational pull, the economic magnet, the voice that could command nods in boardrooms from Wall Street to the World Bank. If Washington sneezed, markets in half a dozen continents caught a cold. The idea that a rising power could simply shrug and walk away from its trade overtures wasn't even considered plausible. It was, at best, the kind of thought experiment professors used to amuse themselves on sleepy Tuesday mornings. And yet, here we are, with India doing exactly that. What makes this shift more remarkable is the symbolism. For decades, the world's economic map looked like a well-rehearsed dance. America led, Western Europe followed, and everyone else tried to keep up without stepping on too many toes. But suddenly, the choreography has been interrupted. India has walked onto the dance floor with its own rhythm, ignoring the conductor's baton, and other nations are watching closely. If India can refuse, perhaps they can too. The balance of power is not just moving eastward, it's fracturing into multiple centers, where no single conductor commands the entire orchestra. The irony is that the US still has immense economic muscle. Its dollar remains the dominant currency, its corporations still tower over global markets, and its cultural exports, from Hollywood blockbusters to tech startups, continue to shape lifestyles worldwide. But power is not simply about size, it's about perception. And the perception that America can be refused, that its offers are not irresistible, is a change of atmosphere so profound that it makes diplomats choke on their diplomatic tea. India's refusal sends a signal not only to Washington but to capitals across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. There is space for maneuver, space for choice, space to say no without the sky falling. Consider how this plays out in the shadow of China. Beijing has long been eager to present itself as an alternative pole of power, building infrastructure, offering loans, and constructing an entirely new narrative of global trade. The US expected India to lean firmly westward as a counterweight, to act as the friendly partner who keep the Indo-Pacific tilted in Washington's favor. But India's refusal unsettles that neat geometry. It is as if the US had been painting a careful picture of the global chessboard, only for India to casually pick up one of the rooks and place it on an entirely different board altogether. And here's where the shift becomes genuinely destabilizing. India's act is not a loud declaration of allegiance to China, nor is it a promise to align with some other bloc. It is instead a refusal to be cornered. That independence, strategic, economic, and symbolic, creates ripples larger than any trade deal on its own could. It shows that the emerging world does not have to define itself by the old binary of America versus China, West versus East. There is, at last, the possibility of a multipolar world where countries are not mere pieces on someone else's chessboard, but players in their own right. For the US, the implications are sobering. Power is most secure when it is invisible, when no one questions it. The moment others begin to test its limits, to decline its offers, to chart their own course, that power begins to feel fragile, vulnerable. India's no was not delivered with defiance nor with hostility. It was calm, calculated, almost casual, and that very calmness is what makes it so disruptive. A shouting match can be dismissed as bluster, but a quiet refusal speaks volumes. The balance of power, then, is not just tilting, it is wobbling, recalibrating, and in that wobble lies both danger and opportunity. For America, it means accepting that the script it has written for decades is no longer universally followed. For India, it means stepping into a new role as a power that does not simply balance between others, but creates balance on its own terms. And for the rest of the world, it means watching the seesaw with bated breath, wondering who will jump next. If you stand very quietly and listen, you can almost hear the compass of global power groaning as it tilts eastward. Not the polite, gentle shift you might expect at the end of a yoga class, but a full-bodied lurch, like someone yanking a rug and sending the furniture skidding across the floor. For centuries, the gravitational pull of trade, finance, and influence pointed firmly westward, to London, to New York, to Washington. Ships, planes, even ideas seemed to flow in that direction, as though the globe itself was rigged on an invisible pulley. India's refusal of the US trade offer is just the latest reminder that the pulley has snapped, and the weight of the world is sliding east with a momentum that can't be ignored. The Eastward Pull isn't just about India, of course. It's part of a broader rebalancing act that has been underway for decades, quietly at first, then more loudly, as countries like China, South Korea, Singapore, and now India have declared themselves not just participants in the global economy, but power centers in their own right. What makes India's moment so striking is that it didn't just join the eastward drift. It accelerated it, giving it the kind of symbolic heft that trade negotiators can only dream of. To say no to the US is not just an economic choice, it's an affirmation that the world no longer has a single center of gravity. The Eastward Pull is visible everywhere you look. In technology, supply chains are snaking their way through Asia, with semiconductors in Taiwan, assembly plants in Vietnam, and research hubs in Bangalore, all proving indispensable. In culture, Bollywood films reach global audiences, K-pop dominates playlists, and anime fills streaming platforms. And in geopolitics, summits once considered peripheral, the BRICS gatherings, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings, are suddenly treated with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for G7 photo ops. The stage lights have shifted, and the actors who were once on the edge of the set are now standing squarely in the spotlight. India's role in this eastward gravitational pull is particularly intriguing because it isn't following the same script as China. China's rise has been choreographed with meticulous planning, a long campaign to challenge Western dominance, often accompanied by a dramatic soundtrack of military parades and slogans. India, by contrast, has opted for a more understated strategy, a quiet confidence, a refusal here, a partnership there, and an unwavering insistence on defining its choices in its own terms. When it says no to the US, it doesn't do so with clenched fists, but with the calm assurance of a guest at a dinner party who knows they have better invitations waiting elsewhere, and those elsewhere options matter. India has been deepening trade links with the rest of Asia, with Africa, with the Middle East. Energy deals with Gulf nations, tech collaborations across Southeast Asia, defense arrangements that look beyond NATO. All of these add up to a tapestry of relationships that spread out eastward and southward, rather than pointing exclusively across the Atlantic. The refusal of America's deal is less a rejection than a reorientation. India is facing the East, and the rest of the world can either pivot with it or risk being left behind. For the US, this is an uncomfortable development. Washington has long assumed that Asia would be its chessboard, with India playing the role of the loyal rook, holding the line against China's advancing pawns. But India has made it clear that it has no intention of being a rook or a knight or any other piece in someone else's game. It prefers to play its own. And in doing so, it has revealed the eastward pull not as a passing fad, but as the defining direction of this century. What makes the pull even more remarkable is its inevitability. Demographics alone tilt the balance eastward. India and China together account for nearly 3 billion people, with hundreds of millions entering the workforce, consuming, producing, innovating. Compare that with the aging populations of the West, and the arithmetic becomes obvious. Economic weight follows population, and population is rooted firmly in the East. The only surprising thing is how long it has taken the world to admit it. And yet, while the eastward pull has been obvious for years, India's refusal makes it unmistakable. It is one thing to predict change in glossy reports or TED Talks. It is another to watch it play out in real time, as a major power calmly declines the advances of a superpower. It's the kind of moment that takes the abstract and makes it concrete, the kind of shift that historians will one day circle in their books with a red pen. So when we talk about the eastward pull, we're not talking about a gentle drift or a speculative trend. We're talking about a redirection of the global compass, a decisive swing that reshapes how trade, diplomacy, and culture will flow for decades to come. And India's quiet, confident no is not just a ripple in that tide, it's the signal that the tide has already turned. And now, as the dust settles and the commentators clear their throats to declare what this all really means, we arrive at that most enjoyable part of any global drama, the witty aftertaste. Because if geopolitics were a play, this would be the act where the audience leans back in their seats, grins at the absurdity of it all, and wonders how the characters managed to get themselves into such a tangled mess in the first place. After all, we're not just witnessing trade deals and diplomatic cables, we're watching the theatre of nations, complete with awkward pauses, dramatic exits, and the occasional pratfall. Let's take a step back and imagine the scene as a comedy of manners. The United States strides into the room with the confident air of a host who believes the party simply cannot go on without them. The champagne has been chilled, the canapes are carefully balanced, and a perfectly rehearsed speech about shared prosperity is ready to be delivered. Then India, impeccably dressed and entirely unruffled, accepts a canapé, declines the champagne, and with a polite smile says, "Actually, I think I'll be leaving early. I've got other places to be." The silence is deafening. Somewhere in the corner, a diplomat drops his fork. And just like that, the party doesn't feel quite so much like the party anymore. The wit of the moment lies not in the drama, but in the calmness of it all. Refusals are usually noisy. People slam doors, deliver speeches in raised voices, or stage dramatic walkouts. But India's refusal was none of that. It was serene, almost casual, the equivalent of a guest quietly slipping out without making a fuss, only for the host to realize that half the guests are now following them to see where they're going instead. There is something deeply funny about how a quiet no can make so much more noise than a shouted yes. And here's where the real comedy sets in. America has always played the role of the reliable protagonist in this global narrative, the one who steps in at the right moment, saves the day, and makes sure everyone remembers who the hero was. But now the script is wobbling, the hero has made an offer, and the side character has said, "No thanks." It's the kind of twist you'd expect in a sitcom, where the supposedly minor character walks off with the best line and leaves the lead looking awkward. If geopolitics had a laugh track, this is where it would kick in. There's also an undeniable irony in the metaphors people are already reaching for. Some say the balance of power is shifting eastward, others insist India is charting its own course. But the truth is, if you strip away the jargon, what has happened is remarkably simple. India said no. That's it. One small word, 2 letters, and suddenly the corridors of power are filled with echoes and speculation. It's a reminder that sometimes the most seismic moments don't arrive with explosions or fireworks, but with the understated elegance of a single syllable. And yet even in its simplicity, the refusal carries wit of its own. Because isn't it rather amusing that the very mechanism once used to bind India, trade treaties, agreements, has now become the stage for its independence? History may have its ironies, but India has delivered the punchline. To a world that once dictated its terms, it has responded with perfect comedic timing, choosing the exact moment when its refusal would land hardest, when the audience would gasp, and when the critics would have no choice but to admit that the story has taken a new turn. If you look closely, you can see how this plays out not just in economics, but in psychology. Nations, like people, build their reputations on habit. America's habit has been to expect agreement, to assume that its offers are irresistible. India's refusal disrupts that habit, creating a pause, an awkward silence, the kind of moment where the other person has to decide whether to laugh, sulk, or pretend it was all part of the plan. And isn't that the essence of wit? To make someone pause, to hold them in that uncomfortable space between laughter and realization. What makes this all the more delicious is that the world is watching with raised eyebrows and barely concealed smiles. Other nations are not just observers, they are the audience at this performance, taking notes, whispering to one another, and wondering if they too might try their hand at improvisation. If India can rewrite its lines, why not them? And if the protagonist can stumble, perhaps the supporting cast has more freedom than they thought. So here we are, standing at the edge of a stage where the script is being rewritten mid-performance. The East has tugged the curtain, the West is fumbling with its lines, and India has delivered a one-word reply that has left the theatre buzzing. The wit-soaked charm of this moment is not in its drama, but in its understatement. After all, in the great play of geopolitics, sometimes the funniest, sharpest line is the one that says the least, and yet changes everything. So perhaps the lesson here is that the world doesn't always move with a bang. Sometimes it shifts with a shrug that says, we have other options, a shrug that turns centuries of assumed power into a moment of awkward silence. India's refusal of America's trade deal is not just a negotiation tactic, it is a reminder that the script has changed, that the spotlight has moved, and that no single actor gets to control the stage forever. And if that unsettles the old order, then perhaps it should, because history is not meant to be comfortable, it is meant to surprise us, to remind us that power is temporary, alliances are flexible, and even the loudest voices must sometimes listen to the quietest word in the room. So let us watch this play unfold with a sense of humour, because the great balancing act of nations has never been a tidy spreadsheet. It has always been a theatre of timing, irony, and wit. And in this case, India has delivered its line perfectly, leaving the rest of the cast scrambling to catch up. Ladies and gentlemen, the balance of power has shifted, not with fire, not with fury, but with something far more disarming, a polite, confident, and world-changing "No,